Yeah. I don't know if
Yeah,
we're gonna
yeah.
do anything with it, but Stuart's been recording them.
Yeah, I'm not sure if ultimately we're going to present this as a podcast or in video format, audio format, or if we'll just write an article on it. I'm very new to
Okay.
podcasting and not particularly good at it yet.
Yeah, yeah,
But we'll see. Anyways, yeah, I appreciate
yeah.
you taking time out of your. It sounds like you've been busy lately, Katie. So thanks for
Yeah.
joining me today.
Mm.
No
What have you been
problem.
working on?
Quite a lot of stuff, but honestly, we're trying to hire for a new person, so it's just been a lot of interviews and reviewing applications and that kind of thing. New director coming on in a couple of weeks, so just a lot of staff transitions. Honestly, it just takes up a lot of time. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
And so the organization's growing. It sounds like this.
Yeah, we're pretty small, so we have 5 full-time staff right now, and we're gonna add one more. And
Yeah. Okay.
then yeah,
Cool.
new
That's
executive
awesome.
director, and our old director is kind of staying on as a fellow. So yeah, expanding a little bit, very slowly, but we are.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And is there what kind of direction are you taking? Like what kind of projects are you guys getting into? Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll probably get into some of this later, unless if you want me to go into some of the things that Stuart asked questions about. But I think
sure.
there's a few things that are kind of on the horizon that we're in the middle of. Beyond Compliance Network, which I'm happy to get into if you'd like. The network of people who are mainly trying to kind of organize to get public agencies in the United States to update their data sharing practices and reporting policies,
Cool.
and think differently about how to integrate community information and data into governance, which I think is actually the harder part. We,
Wow. Yeah,
yeah,
that's cool. That's a good idea, I guess, eh? Like that's if they put it in
yeah.
their governance practice, like you have to work it into their policy manuals and everything, eh? I guess.
Yeah, and agencies, most public agencies have public reporting policies, and there was a memo a few years ago that was released by an office at the White House that required all agencies to update their open access policies. So like their
Oh, wow.
stuff is happening. There is a lot of movement in the United States right now, but we're also technologically government agencies. I can't speak for all of them, but some of the ones that
Yeah.
I've worked with are just a little behind. Like they're going through modernization efforts. This isn't as related to the work I'm doing right now, but a project that we had worked on a couple years ago was trying to work with Congress in the United States to hold more remote kind of town hall and other kinds of meetings where they could get information from their constituents, because they were still like they adopted Zoom when the pandemic started, so like
Okay, yeah,
new
yeah,
things have spurred modernization. Like they've only
yeah.
recently stopped like faxing things to each other
Wow,
in the last
wow.
like 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, yeah.
So
It's
stuff
not
like that.
surprising, like you see it. Yeah, for sure. It's the
Yeah,
same here.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know how like what you know about us, but we were in reforestation our whole careers,
Mm,
and we were moving more and more into like using computers and making administrative tools. And then we started to like we wanted to look at data, just look at like a lot of tree planting data.
mm,
And we could not for the life of us find any. And we've been
yeah,
creating that data and sharing it with like our employers and the government our whole career. And then we're like, well, could
yeah,
we see some? And they wouldn't share like and like literally nothing at all.
yeah,
And we did like FOIP, like we did the freedom of information stuff
yeah,
and everything. And they're just like, oh, well, why would you want to know? And it's like, well, why would we not want to know? Like, like what are
yeah,
you hiding all the trees that we planted? It's so weird. Like,
yeah,
but then I thought about the whole environment and the whole thing is the same thing, eh? Like everyone's
what,
sort of arguing about it, but no one's really looking at the numbers, eh? Like,
yeah. I'm really curious who you were asking for access to the data. Were they like city and local governments, or were these larger agencies?
the
Or okay,
provinces govern reforestation and because in
okay,
Canada a lot of it's public land, so it's their data, like it's their
yeah,
land and it's kind of paid for by the public in a way. So it's like it just seems like why would you hide the numbers? Why not show all the work they've done?
yeah,
I don't think like yeah. Anyway, so it was just the provincial governments like some of the really small ones were kind of okay with it. I think they were a bit more transparent, but the
Hmm.
bigger ones just didn't. They were very tight-lipped.
And sometimes we're finding that uh, there's an appetite for sharing data in better ways, but just
Yeah,
not capacity. So like I've talked about, a
yeah,
lot of agencies are going through a modernization process. Procurement, which is like the least sexy topic in policy, but
yeah.
is so important for those kinds of modernization processes. Like a lot of agencies have really outdated procurement policies about who they're allowed to source new
Okay,
products
yeah,
from, if they're allowed to prioritize open source and that kind of thing.
yeah,
So yeah, I think it's often like a combination of, is there actually an appetite? Are people prioritizing public access, and can they actually do it if they want to? So both of
yeah.
those things really have to be in place.
Yeah, I found a big problem for us. I didn't just request information from Canadian provinces. Part of our investigation was U.S. states. And a big problem I found was the reply I would usually get was, this information is just spread across so many PDFs, across
Yeah,
so many organizations. It would cost tens of thousands of dollars to consolidate all of it and present it to you. And I
Hmm.
don't have that personally, just lying
yeah,
around in my bank account. But
Yeah.
it's a huge logistical struggle, and I imagine that there's a similar struggle in other sectors of environmental data.
yeah, yeah. The PDF problem is one we talk about quite a bit,
Yeah.
and even beyond that, just digitizing information. Sometimes things are still on paper, and they got to get it into a computer. Um,
Totally.
yeah,
But I think like even if we just audit it, or we're like, well, could we see some, or could we see
yeah,
examples, or how is the database structured? What do the tables
hmm
look like? Like just to see that, and that was kind of like just to
That was
start,
hopefully
and
true.
that, yeah, well, just to know like what does it even look like. So yeah, I guess it was both. Like some people said, oh, it's too hard or it's complicated, or other people said that they just were skeptical why we would want to see the numbers or whatever. I
yeah.
think that what I really wondered about with your organization is like trying to get people interested in like if there was more political motivation for it. I think maybe
Mm.
people don't realize it's a problem. Like they just assume someone's looking after the numbers or something.
Yeah, yeah, and it's hard to get people to care about infrastructure. We talk about data
Yeah,
infrastructure quite a bit, and
yeah,
people were starting to talk about the built infrastructure a lot more. We had a huge build infrastructure and Jobs Act a few years ago in the United States, and now it's part of a national conversation.
it was a
But
built infrastructure
so like
bill, like
roads,
a okay,
bridges,
yeah,
that kind of thing,
yeah,
dams.
okay, yeah,
Um, but like even data infrastructure is even harder for people to grasp
yeah,
if you're not working with data. It's hard to get people to care about it. Ideally, if it's working well, you can't see it at all, unless you're really getting into the data yourself.
right, right,
Um, but that's kind of how we think about infrastructure: is well built and well designed infrastructure should not be super visible, probably.
wow,
So that inherently makes it difficult for people to care about.
yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like the pitch or like the sell, like if there was some, like we're starting to maybe think about getting away from using the word data, like because it's kind of
Mm,
like maybe intimidating to people, that
yeah.
maybe it would be more about information or that, I don't know,
Right.
we're just really trying to think of how to engage people in
Yeah.
the conversation, Like, as if there was more political motivation, God, I'm sure it would move faster, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think data is sometimes, I mean, it is a four-letter word, but it's sometimes a four-letter word.
yeah,
And it can be intimidating. I'm not a data scientist either. So, like,
yeah,
when I've been to conferences that are just about data and data infrastructure, and even I, who works for an organization called Open Environmental Data Project, like,
yeah,
feel intimidated in some of those spaces.
for sure.
I think information and knowledge it really depends on who you're talking to, but I think information is something that most people can grasp and doesn't feel so scary. Everyone knows what
Yeah,
information is, and
yeah.
yeah.
And transparency, like maybe a word like
Hmm.
that. Because we're looking at like the search terms and like nobody searches environmental data. Like,
Yeah.
like this is not like a big term, that people search
Yeah.
for. Like, but it's so important. And I'm like, it's too bad there's such a disconnect, eh? Like,
Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't know if this is kind of a hunch, so I'll caveat it with that, but um, I might guess that in at least in environmental justice spaces, uh, getting really specific about the aspect of the environment that you're working with or concerned with is maybe a little bit easier for people to kind of grab onto. So like
Oh yeah.
pollution, um,
Okay, yeah.
air quality, water quality, like that tells someone, oh, this is something that I'm breathing in. This is something that I'm consuming or I'm feeding
Yeah,
to my
okay, no, that's a
children
good
or
point.
whatever, you know? Something that helps people connect it to their own personal lived experience. And so y'all are
Yeah.
working with like forest information and trees and so I mean I don't have like I probably shouldn't like give you advice on like how to
No,
think about
that's a
your
great,
communications, but I'm just thinking
yeah.
about like how could you connect with people's experiences about the information that you're
Absolutely.
talking
No,
about.
that's a great idea. Something more tangible. Yeah, it's too abstract for something environmental. Like it's not as tangible like water or air and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about personal experiences, actually.
Sure.
Katie, what I think you said that your original you're not a data scientist, as you
Yeah.
said a moment ago. Your original background, I think you told me on the phone, was in carbon accounting, right?
Yeah, I studied carbon accounting,
Uh,
did a few different research projects in grad school at UC Davis. Yeah, I've first started actually working with the Forest Service, the United States Forest Service, and they were part of kind of a broader, I'm going to use the word coalition, but they probably wouldn't use that word. They had to be a kind of unbiased uh,
mhm.
actor within that group, but a group of people who were trying to build a protocol for urban forest management and tree planting as part of the carbon offset and carbon markets. Um, and so I was at UC Davis, and they brought a couple of us in to support some of this research. And yeah, I mean, it was really interesting. One thing that kind of came out of it though is that it was really really difficult to get any buy-in for the tree planting protocols.
Oh yeah.
It was just not cost effective for the kinds of entities that we were targeting. So municipalities. Um, oh, I'm seeing recording stopped due to low browser storage, but that might just be on my end.
It's just on your end. My
Okay,
recording
cool.
is continuing, yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry, what was I saying? Yeah, for municipalities, for campuses, utilities, it just wasn't cost effective for them to do tree planting to be able to be part of those markets. But we did
Hmm.
find that people were a lot more interested in the larger like urban forest management protocols. So I
Cool.
don't know exactly who has taken those up, but I do know that there was a lot more interest, and I think it was a lot more cost effective to think about forests from a systems level rather than planting new trees in small areas of land.
Yeah,
Um,
cool.
so part of my job there wasn't so much accounting, although that was part of the project. It was more thinking about if policies were actually leading to more tree planting, more carbon storage, um, and what other kinds of social externalities, positive or otherwise, might come out of projects like this. But after that, I actually ended up doing some carbon accounting. I learned life cycle analysis and did some research on California almonds, which is generally the biggest cash crop produced in California,
Oh, really? Wow.
and using a ton of water.
Yeah, I've heard,
So
yeah.
it was at the time, still kind of is, but at the time there was a lot of debate around whether or not we should be growing as many almonds as we were.
Yeah.
We're still putting them in. They're still
Yeah,
everywhere.
okay.
But
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I was focused on the kind of like processing side of things. What kind of emissions were coming out of shelling and hulling almonds and then
Yeah.
transporting them. Most of our almonds produced in California are going to Asia and Europe. Some of them
Huh.
are staying here in North America, but for a large part, they're leaving the country. And so it was just interesting to think about the amount of emissions and water usage involved in that process when the product wasn't even staying in our local economies.
Is
Um,
Can is California transparent with that kind of information? Like,
I wouldn't say so. It actually, so I went and toured and surveyed a bunch of different processing facilities, and it was so
Nice.
hard to get people to just let me in.
Wow.
That
Wow.
information is not public because most of those are private corporations. They're really protective of their intellectual property, and they don't want any
Whoa.
competitors to know, what inputs they're using, what their equipment looks like, and that kind of
Yeah, with the
thing.
equipment look. Yeah, yeah. Okay,
So
I
I
know that
assigned
game.
so many NDAs
Wow. Okay,
to
yeah.
actually do
Wow.
that work. It's not public.
I've done some of that.
Yeah.
I've done husking like the cones. Like I
Oh
was
yeah.
into processing cones and getting the
Okay.
seeds out, and that
Yeah.
was super proprietary. Like we were trying to build
Oh,
these
interesting.
machines and copy each other and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that was fun.
It's
But
funny
yeah, but
super
the
retired
data part should be.
because I've seen
Sorry,
those.
what's it?
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. It's just kind of a
No,
side note.
please.
It's like I've seen those, and they're so low tech, low grade looking. It's funny to me that that's proprietary.
Well, they're not mass
Yeah.
produced like a because it's niche. You're just building one instead of building like 1,000 that you make really nice.
Totally,
Anyway,
totally. It just looks like
yeah.
something that my uncle could have made in his garage, but that's a side note. Sorry, Katie.
That's okay.
Were your experiences there kind of what led to the light bulb moment in your head where you were like, open data, this is probably the way?
I mean, that was probably the beginning of it. It's hard to like pinpoint when that happened, but it was such a struggle to find information that I'm sure that influenced my career path and how I, the kinds of jobs and ideas that I looked for. Um, I think I might have mentioned this to you the first time we talked, Stuart, but there was a project that I was involved with where we were kind of auditing an improved cook stove project in rural Kenya. And I think that might have been, I mean, that really drove the point home. So this was a carbon offset project where they were trying to distribute improved cook stoves because people in this part of Kenya were generally just using what they call a three-stone method, which is just three stones and you build a fire and cook over it. Kind of your normal campfire type of method, which leads to a lot of indoor air pollution,
Yeah, I bet.
requires a lot of fuel. So they were distributing this pretty low cost, low tech cook stove, but it was kind of like a cinder block, and it had a lining in it that was supposed to make fuel efficiency higher, so you didn't have to collect as much wood. Um, so that was ostensibly, to do three things to help, to be able to sell carbon offsets or credits, to reduce indoor air pollution and to reduce harvesting of wood from forests. But we found evidence of pretty fraudulent activities there. So like they were paying households to pretend that they were using those stoves so that when the auditor came by, they could tell them that they were using it.
Yeah, I always. So what was the resistance then? Why weren't people using them? They weren't that
They
practical,
weren't
or
very good. They were really bad
yeah. Okay.
stoves.
Okay. Yeah.
We heard so many complaints about how they just didn't really work.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And most of the people who are using these they're women, and they don't have like a ton of extra time. They're taking care of children.
Totally.
So, trying to use this new thing that is not actually making your life any easier, it just wasn't going to happen.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
So that's a pretty different side of open data. But I remember thinking, it's hard to share some of that information because it's about individual people. It could be sensitive. The people who the data would be about are already vulnerable in a lot of ways. They live they live in poverty, a lot of them.
Hmm.
So you don't necessarily just want to share all of that data. But for that kind of, if we're going to allow people to continue polluting and
Yeah.
emitting greenhouse gases, like we've got to have
Yeah.
some level of transparency if we can't trust an auditor or the actual project operator to be acting in good faith. And even if you do trust them, like it's always good to have a backstop of public scrutiny.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's what's kind of the thing with the tree planting. Like part of the reason we're public facing, or we want to be now, is that we're looking at ESG trees. Like, and when we're in the
Mm.
industry and we're working for industry, it's all fine and well. Like, but when you're working for the environment, you have that problem of like transparency and then the allocation of the funds. So the
Yeah.
funds aren't allocated very well. Like if people are producing a cook stove that no one's using, then it's not good. And same as if they're paying to plant all these trees, but then the trees aren't getting sent where they should.
Yeah.
And so then you need that data as well. Like how useful is that? You know, and there's lots of tricks and
Right.
ways you can collect data. Like I would say for those stoves, just charge for them, charge a little bit. You know, and if
Hmm.
someone's buying them, you know, there's ways to play with the,
Yeah.
you know, you could see the distribution or the demand in certain areas and stuff like that. So that's what we're trying to look for with trees is like, but just even we're just even like trying to get a yeah, just more data, just more information about where the
Hmm.
trees are going, and we could. Problem is very fixable, but the way it is now, no one's disclosing anything, and they're just
Yeah.
the trees aren't going where they should, and I could tell. But yeah, we just need more
Yeah.
information, or I think there should be an expectation that that data should be transparent, and that's what we're saying is that like there needs to be a
Data
demand for the
is the antidote to greenwashing. Yeah.
yeah
Yeah.
yeah
Yeah.
so
I mean,
yeah
there's always a risk of leakage. We talked about that a lot when I was working for the Forest Service, or for with the Forest Service, I should say. Um, like if you are using fossil fuels to transport seeds or seedlings or trees somewhere where they're going to
hmm
get planted, then is that being
yeah
accounted for in how you're calculating the emissions that you've saved? Like there's
yeah.
all kinds of ways for people to game that system, and not actually lead to real greenhouse gas emissions reductions. You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, 100%. Yeah. Yeah, and that's it. They're just making these huge claims that they've, you know, saved how many carbon or whatever, but there's no
Yeah.
information about where the trees went or anything. Like, and that's like across the board. Like there are some organizations that are transparent, but not very many. Like,
Yeah.
and so yeah, I don't know. It's great. Like we're really glad to see that you guys are doing what you are, and you know, I hope that there's more people trying to push the message, I guess, and
Yeah.
lobby and do
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, I think at this point you really need that lever to come from policy. Like corporations aren't. I guess these aren't necessarily corporations you're talking about. They're cities or provinces. But if sometimes you need a lever coming from the top telling that you have to do something or else you're not going to receive the funding that that you've expected.
Yeah,
And with corporations, you absolutely need that. I guess with public agencies, it kind of depends on capacity and where, how much, what they have in terms of talent and expertise and that kind of thing. But if you're making a profit, you should you should be held
yeah,
accountable for what you're doing. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, no, for sure. So that's you guys are more focused on policy, I guess, eh? Like lobby.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, we are focused on public environmental governance systems. So, I think policy. I guess we think about policy in a kind of a broad way. So there's legislation, but there's also how things are implemented. So, like voters are never going to vote on a the EPA's, the Environmental Protection Agency's reporting policy. That's like we don't need people to get that detailed into how the EPA operates. Hopefully, I mean, we'll see how this next election goes. That a Trump administration would mean a lot of changes for the EPA, but that kind of way of an agency operating is something that is ideally a little bit more flexible and changeable. And so we also focus on that part of policy, things that we're not necessarily, lobbying publicly for, or if we are, um, it's not through like voting and election channels. It's through we know that you have this priority, EPA. They've talked a lot about environmental justice. They have, the White House I mentioned has released this public access policy. So all agencies by 2025 have to update their public access policies. So that's data and
Oh,
research
cool.
outputs. They
Wow.
don't tell them how they have to update them. They
Yeah,
have to
okay.
update them.
Yeah, okay.
So we know that there's appetite for this. A lot of what we do at OEDP, and particularly in the Beyond Compliance network that I mentioned earlier, is thinking through what are the actual steps to getting an agency there. First of all, like what are the recommendations for how you should change your reporting policy? But we're also thinking about what kind of capacity building is required for an agency to actually do that correctly. I don't know if I have a ton of like great answers to like that second question, but it is something that we think about quite a lot.
Well,
Cool.
do you
No,
want to
that's
just tell
great.
us maybe a little bit more about the Beyond Compliance project and
Yeah,
some of the
yeah.
agencies that you guys target in that? Yeah, go on.
So that's a network of a little over 30 people right now from almost 30 different organizations, public agencies at both the federal, state, and local level, actually. So some city agencies are represented, as well as almost all of, well, not almost all of them, but the majority of the people in the network are actually coming from either environmental justice organizations or organizations like OEDP. So we have a much more national and sometimes international scope, but you were focused on like systems level change in environmental policy. And the broad goal is to make public data that is already supposed to be public more usable and actually, you know, I was going to say actually public, but like actually available and accessible. We talked about the PDF problem. So that's kind of like that's often the bare minimum that agencies are doing in order to comply with requirements to share information publicly. But as you both know, and as a lot of people who try to access public information know, like it's so tedious to get that information out of some of those documents. Beyond the PDF problem, there are lots of unstandardized data formats.
Yeah, that's a
It's hard
huge
to
thing.
take data from one place and integrate it with other kinds of data. Actually do modeling and analysis with it.
Yeah,
It's often not very contextualized, so it's hard to know like where the data was collected specifically. You might
yeah,
know what facility it's from, but how close is it to like, the point source? How close is it to the fence line? How close is it to the people who live right there?
wow,
That kind of thing. I mean, there's time of day is probably more standard than other things, but that kind of context is not often present. And so a lot of what we do is we try to synthesize what are the actual needs of people who are looking for this information. And a lot of these, like I said, are environmental justice organizations who are, pursuing litigation against polluting facilities.
sorry, these are the environmental justice, like they're people that are asking you, or they're people that are asking the government organizations, like,
Asking the government. So
yeah, okay, yeah,
maybe as an example, we work with. I'm trying to think. There's a lot of organizations that are part of this, but there's an organization
yeah,
called the Chesapeake Bay Legal Alliance,
oh yeah,
and they're very concerned with lots of environmental problems, but air pollution
mm,
is one of them. And so the EPA in the United States is charged with sharing pollution information from certain kinds of facilities. So these are,
hmm,
this is the fossil fuel industry. These are steel refineries, chemical manufacturing plants, paper manufacturing, that kind of thing, mines.
hmm,
That information, which actually maybe I'll back up a little bit. That information is required to be collected by facilities in order for them to obtain a permit to operate and pollute. That information is then submitted to states, and then the states send that to the EPA at the federal level. And so there's lots of steps where like things can get lost along the way, and it can be hard to aggregate. But the EPA is then supposed to share that publicly, and they do. But like I said, there's lots of problems with how it's shared. It's not often very timely, so it might be like too late by the time someone is able to actually access the information for someone to do something with it. So a lot of what we do is try to find, what are the actual concerns of these organizations? What do they want to do with the data? What problems are they running into? And then trying to come up with solutions that we can advocate for with those agencies. And it's not just EPA. We're also talking about state agencies. Maybe we'll get into this a little bit later. We're talking about FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States. Yeah, so that's kind of like the biggest goal. We've come up with a set of recommendations that we're in the middle of, trying to figure out how to get in front of the right people. We've just called it an advocacy toolkit. It's on our Beyond Compliance website.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. But
Sounds useful.
we also think about how do you get community information into those processes too, which is a really, really hard question. It's exciting because the EPA and other agencies are increasingly more interested in integrating community knowledge, and involving more people in governance processes. But there
What do
aren't.
you mean? Sorry, what do you mean community information? Like,
Yeah, so data that is collected by communities themselves. So a lot of organizations, environmental justice organizations, including the one that I had mentioned earlier, they're collecting their own data. They there's been a proliferation of air quality sensors. You might have heard of Purple Air. I know we had talked about wildfires last time Stuart and I talked, and a lot of people are installing these sensors in their own homes to understand
wow.
air quality.
Oh, yeah.
Similarly with water quality, although I think there's tool proliferation in that space is probably less visible, but a lot of people are collecting their own information. They also know, at an experiential level, what it feels like to live in pollution. So we kind of see that as really important context that you could connect with quantitative information. Like, what does this actually feel like to breathe this in? What does it smell like? What does it do to my day and my energy? So it's really difficult to integrate that kind of information into governance for a lot of reasons. And one is just that there's still this kind of tendency in the government to not take that kind of information seriously. And there are sometimes good reasons for that. Like the tools that people are using, the sensors that we're using aren't necessarily quality controlled in a way that they might meet standards set by the government.
Wow. Yeah.
But those standards are also confusing to people. We've talked a lot about clarifying what those standards actually are and how people who build sensors can meet them. And then contextual information is just it's almost I was going to say it's inherently unstandardized, which I don't think that's true, but a lot of it is. A lot of qualitative information you can't standardize. So
Yeah.
how do you figure out what you can allow into a decision-making process about how to hold a polluter accountable?
Sorry if I can.
No, go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry. Well, do you find like there's a lot of open data repositories or maybe like centralized places or ways of disclosing, or do you see it becoming more streamlined? Like, because it's just sort of an abyss of options and people talking about it. Like, do you
Yeah,
think one of them is going to come out as be like the biggest repo of data or like?
I think so. OpenAQ, OpenAQ stands for air quality, is a
Yeah.
pretty good place to find uh, air quality data that's collected all over the world by people using their own sensors, and they also
Yeah.
sometimes
Cool.
include like government sensors in those data sets.
Yeah.
Um, but I yeah, there aren't a ton of centralized places where you can find community data. And a lot of times
Yeah.
people don't necessarily want to share that information publicly either.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of communities that we've talked to, they talk about how they're worried that the data will get misused. It could be used to, reduce the selling price of their homes if they want to resell it.
Oh yeah.
It could
Yeah.
be
Okay.
used to increase
Yeah.
insurance rates.
Wow.
So there's a lot of skepticism, especially a lot of these communities have historically been disregarded by government. At best, sometimes they've, been violently removed or experienced state-sponsored violence. So, I mean, we're talking about environmental racism a lot of the time. So
Wow.
there's a lot of distrust for
Yeah.
good reason. And we're trying at OEDP and with Beyond Compliance, we're trying to figure out how do you navigate those conversations where we can make the flow of information easier, but still let communities and vulnerable people maintain control and ownership of information that could be used against them.
Yeah.
How do we make sure that benefit is actually coming back to the people that data is about? Yeah.
Do you tell them to disclose it in a certain way or just store it in a certain format or something? Like, I
I
guess
don't.
that's in the toolkit or whatever.
Yeah, we don't tell. I don't know that we've really. You could say we tell communities what to do with their data, but
Yeah.
we've worked with several community organizations to try to come up with governance protocols. So, um, using tools like licenses or data sharing agreements or terms of use, which are often like these are soft tools. Like
Yeah.
someone could still misuse information and not be held accountable if no one's going to sue them for it. But
Hmm.
there are at least like I wouldn't say easy, but lower hanging fruit kind of steps that communities can take to protect themselves. So we have talked about that. We also talk with a lot of communities about uh, yeah, not necessarily just sharing your data publicly and having a but having some kind of way for people to, get in touch with you and talk to you about how they might want to use the data and then using one of these tools possibly to facilitate access for specific purposes for specific people. Yeah.
That kind of touches on one of the themes, I think, in our original conversation, Katie, where
Mm,
you talked about the spectrum of openness of data.
yeah.
I wondered if we could touch on that just a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think we at OEDP we really think that openness is a spectrum. I actually before I worked at OEDP, I'm a little bit like wary of. I don't want to bash a previous organization, but I've worked for open science projects and organizations where there really is an almost dogmatic approach to openness. Like you're either open and you're closed, and it's a binary, and that's it.
Okay.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
anything in between, unless sensitive information is involved, is just closed. Um, and I think a lot of times, like I said, there's a lot of distrust in a lot of environmental justice communities. There's also a lot of distrust of scientists and researchers.
Wow.
And terms like open data or open science, I think also scare people.
Okay.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
so we are trying to kind of socialize this idea of openness being more of a spectrum. We work on this project called the Seek Commons project, and using a kind of commons framing has felt pretty helpful.
Like the that's a cool idea. Seed commons?
Seek Commons. So it
Seed commons.
doesn't have
Okay,
anything to do
right,
with
right. I
seeds,
saw
but
that.
it's just
Yeah, seed commons.
an
No, I
acronym
saw the
for
thing.
socio-environmental knowledge commons.
Yeah, commons. That's a really good trick. That's a good
Yeah.
sounds like it ticks the box without sounding
Yeah, I mean,
it's
commons can mean
relatable.
open. I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah.
if you have common information, maybe it is fully public and open for anyone to use for whatever purposes. But
Yeah.
maybe you're only, maybe you're a researcher working with a community that only wants this data to be used by certain kinds of people for certain kinds of purposes. And if that data is about you, then I personally believe that that's your right. So, what kind of conversations and tools can we create for people to think about these governance ideas, ownership, control,
Yeah.
authority?
Yeah. Yeah, control and authority. Yeah, are kind of like negative terms in a way, I guess. Like or it's
They
not something
they
that
can be, but I think they also can give some of these communities a sense of safety. Like I'm
okay, that
maintaining
they have
control of
control.
my own
Yeah, okay.
information.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah,
Wow.
I think they can have different connotations for sure, though.
Yeah. Yeah, I heard this. I heard this talk the other day. It was like it was a business thing, but she was saying like that something's honoring partnership, that they were having some sort of partnership like with the shareholders, and it wasn't really
Mm-hmm.
honoring partnership. And I thought, oh, that's kind of a cool way to say it because you throw these terms around. Everyone agrees that partnership, like that's what you want in the partnership, but then like to honor partnership is to actually make good on it. So
Yeah,
I just think of like honoring the commons or like this idea of community. Everyone
yeah,
thinks it's a good idea. So how do we really honor community? And that's by sharing. You have to share.
and if we are all members of this community, like we are all stewarding this commons together,
Hmm.
maybe I don't own this piece of it, but I can treat it and its owners with respect.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
yeah,
In
Yeah, it's a
terms of
commons, even though you could be privately owned, but it's still a commons in a way. Like,
hmm
Yeah, that's really cool. Sorry, Stu.
No, no, all good. In terms of other new terms, Katie, I've heard of fair data, but OEDP introduced me to care data. I wonder if we could go into that a bit.
Yeah. So, fair, I often think of, so fair, I guess, if you're going to publish this, for people who don't know, it's findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability.
Wow.
And those are really principles for data stewardship. Um, how do we, how do we maintain and manage data so that it fits these principles? And it's something that people in the Seek Commons Network would want me to say is that FAIR is not necessarily open. Um, they are often they can often overlap, but they don't mean the same thing.
Okay.
CARE, on the other hand, is really about indigenous data governance. So CARE stands for collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And there's kind of
Wow.
sub principles within those, but these were developed by indigenous researchers across the world, actually. I think
Really? That
people,
sounds really
yeah,
cool.
people who were involved were, they were from, I think the original meeting actually happened in Botswana, but there were people who've been involved have come from tribes in the United States, New
Hmm.
Zealand, Maori folks involved in that process, and they kind of, from what I understand, I wasn't involved in the development of these, but I think they saw gaps in what fair and open were trying to present.
Wow.
And with indigenous data and knowledge, there are particular concerns and interests around how information is used and who has access. And so I, we often, I often look to CARE as an inspiration for how we might think about data coming from other kinds of vulnerable communities, but it's also really important to remember that like indigenous sovereignty is a very specific thing that does not apply to every community.
Hmm.
But things like collective benefit and ethics and responsibility, like these are things
Yeah.
that all kinds of communities care about. So
Yeah, no, this is
how are
super
we
cool.
how are we making sure that data and indigenous data in particular is being used in a way that the people who that data is about or that it impacts are actually going to experience the benefits of it. It's not just going to be extracted from them and then someone publishes a paper and that's it.
Yeah.
They talk often about capacity building. So, how can we think about increasing data science and data literacy in indigenous communities so that they can actually, understand and use some of this data on the kind of more technical end? I talked a little bit about like who has access, and so with indigenous information in particular, there's a lot of knowledge that is really only meant for certain people. Really, like, elders are really the only people who are supposed to have access to it. They may have, the option to share that with others as they choose, but like there are indigenous protocols that these vary widely by tribe, but that govern what they're able to do with that information and who should see it at all. So CARE is meant to be a framework for helping people think about how to protect those rights. And I would say fair, care, and open, like these are all frameworks. Like they're not, fair is
Yeah.
maybe a little bit more on the prescriptive end if you would like it to be. There's like pretty specific, if you search for fair and find their website, like they're very specific requirements that they put out there. Care is really, it's hard to like, I think a lot of people have had trouble operationalizing care. And that's because you
Hmm.
can't just like check the box and say, okay, now this is care. Like care
Yeah.
really
Okay.
requires you to have a conversation with the people that this information is about. And that conversation might be iterative and it
Yeah.
might take a long time. So I think people are struggling with operationalizing it, but there's a lot of interest in actually doing that. And so we are at OEDP, we're kind of thinking through how we might support that process. How can we, like, what can we point to in terms of good examples or models for people actually using care principles? What kind of tools or templates might we create that people can use to, have these conversations? Um, yeah, yeah. So that's care.
Well, what kind of
Cool.
models are there?
There's not a ton. So the care principles aren't very old. They're I shouldn't give you a date because I'll probably mess it up, but they're less than a decade old for sure. Fair is actually probably also not that old, but uh, yeah, I don't even know if I could point to a very specific one. I will say we're working on a project right now with a community up in Alaska, Ukiagvik or Barrow. It's the northernmost part of Alaska. And it's the ancestral home of the Inupiat people. They still live there. The Ukiagvik is still majority Inupiat. Um,
Wow.
and we're thinking about how to I'll back up a little bit. We're working with researchers who have co-designed a research project up there to try to measure permafrost melt and see how that's impacting built infrastructure. So things like the hospital, the housing authority, roads, and that kind of thing. Because permafrost is melting and it is happening more quickly. And so they've co-designed a process to collect information. They're using open hardware, open sensors to do this. And we're starting to think through how do we bring care into this process beyond this kind of co-design and co-management of the sensors? How do we think about how data is shared and visualized so that not just, people involved in this project or people with a PhD in climate science can understand it. We
Hmm.
actually did a workshop over the summer with high school students, so people who are probably at least on some level interested in the data, but have probably the least experience with data of all the people that we'd like to give access to the information, and tried to understand from them what they wanted to see, what they understood from it, and what we could do to visualize and share it in a way that was going to be understandable to them. That's kind of just a first step. I think eventually we'd love to do a kind of similar thing with the actual tribal authority, people who are using that information to make decisions about where roads get repaired or buildings get built. But yeah, how do we bring collective benefit back to the community that this information is about, where the data is being collected? How do we improve capacity at the local level to understand the information? I don't know if I can say it's a model yet, but it's something that we're working on, and hopefully it'll turn out well.
That's
That's
really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun to go up there. It was basically a summer camp, so I was like a camp counselor for a week, which is not something I expected to do with this job, but I loved it. So
Oh, that's great. That
yeah,
sounds like our jobs.
yeah.
That's
not
what tree
anymore.
planners do. Not anymore, yeah. We don't talk about yeah. Um, cool. That's great.
I have another question for you, Katie,
Mm,
and it's kind of pertinent because I don't know if you two can hear what's going on in the background right now, but
mm,
there's a terrible rainstorm happening.
Uh,
Anyways, I saw on your site, I don't remember if this was on Seek Commons or on
mm,
one of the other projects, but there was a cool example about how the use of flooding data.
mm.
Well, it was just a good example, I thought, of how environmental data should be made more open and accessible for the public interest. Are you familiar with that project? Can we dive in?
Yeah, yeah. So that's actually also part of Beyond Compliance, although it's kind of separate from what we've been doing with Beyond Compliance up until the last few months or so. Um, but the Beyond Compliance model is actually that we conduct interviews with people who are trying to use data. We see if people are interested in doing some organizing together and trying to build an assembly or a coalition, the way that we've done with this group right now. And so we've done that a little bit with people who are trying to access flooding and climate information. Um, TBD on where it goes, but one of the ideas that came out of that, out of our conversations in a workshop we held last year, um, with people who are largely, they're planners at the city level largely, or consultants working with those planners. Um, what do they need from flooding and climate information to do their jobs well and to be able to predict the impacts of extreme flooding on their cities and other and rural areas? Um, and a lot came out of that, but I think one of the most exciting things was maybe exciting isn't the right word. I think there's an opportunity for this right now, is to get FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or NOAA, which is our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So those are kind of like the two agencies people go to for flooding and climate data here. Can we get them to build a clearinghouse or some kind of certification for third-party climate data and models? And the reason this is there's a good opportunity for this right now, is that the first thing is that it's really difficult to downscale global climate models. Global climate models they've proven to be pretty accurate at the planetary level, but when you try to get down to like what's going to happen to Philadelphia or Baltimore, it's really, really hard. So a lot of I don't know if I can say a lot, but there's kind of been this small explosion in third party modeling projects or organizations who are starting to sell access to their climate models. Kind of the big one is called First Street Foundation, and they're kind of considered the gold standard for climate models. But it's really expensive to use them. And a lot of cities, especially those that are not very big or don't have a huge tax base, like they just can't afford access to that model or their data. And even if you can have access to them, some people would say they're black boxes. They have tried to open source some of their methods, but even, open source doesn't necessarily mean it's understandable and that you can just take it and put it somewhere else. So they're difficult. It's difficult to understand what's actually going on in the model and how it was built. And so, not everyone, but a lot of people are trying to access like First Street Foundations and other kinds of models. They're having trouble doing that. And they also just we don't know if they're actually the gold standard. They're just kind of considered the gold standard. So we're thinking about, could an agency like FEMA or NOAA put some kind of like stamp of approval on this model or this organization, and also maybe loop in access to those models as part of the funding and regranting that they do to cities and states. A lot of cities and states receive funding from FEMA in the wake of disasters like floods. So can we think more preventatively? FEMA is providing funding for people to do more preparation before flooding actually happens. So and they are providing funding for some states and cities to actually pay for these models, but can we tie that like stamp of approval with the funding and support to access them, and just make it easier for planners to be able to use these?
Yeah, it seems like this is very important information, and it seems a little, how should I put it, sketchy to just let these organizations just say, bro, trust me.
Yeah, sketchy is not an inaccurate word, I would say. Yeah. Yeah, it's there's recent reporting and Bloomberg talked about this. The First Street Foundation, actually, in particular, they used to be a nonprofit, and they recently became a B Corp. So they care about making a profit. Absolutely. And they have a right to make a profit from their work. But this is disasters like flooding are becoming more frequent. They're becoming harder to predict. They're having a lot more impact on people's lives. I think to get back to one of your original questions, Stuart, or the ones that you sent me, there's a time and a place for privacy, and I think there's a time and a place where like we really need to get some of this information as open and accessible as possible. And disastrous flooding, to me, feels like enough of a push to make something like this possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I just kind of saw that as analogous to our own struggle with trees and reforestation, because we see wildfires and carbon sequestration as a huge crisis also.
Absolutely.
One where the solutions can't be a black box.
Yeah, wildfire too actually is a lot of the same people who are doing climate models specifically related to flooding are also thinking about wildfire. So First Street Foundation also has wildfire models as well. So I think there's beyond flooding, that kind of openness of these models and data could support lots of different areas of environmental governance.
Oh, microphone. Cool. I don't know if Chris has any more questions. Katie, my own personal final question for now, I think, is I know that you have some international focus, but for the most part, you guys are based in the U.S., right?
Yeah.
You don't work with any Canadian organizations?
So no, actually we do. I might need to. I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer, but I probably need to tell someone that I will be a little bit late. If you give me 1 second, I do want to answer that question.
Cool.
Okay. Yeah, so we've worked with an organization called Animiki. They are an indigenous, I can't remember actually if they're a nonprofit or if they're a corporation. I think they are a nonprofit based out of Vancouver, I believe. Actually, I think they're all over Canada. But yeah, Animikii. And they actually came up with us to Ukiagvik in the summer and helped us run that workshop with those high school students.
Cool.
They are. I probably should have mentioned them when you asked for models for Indigenous data governance. They're doing a lot of really cool work with actually taking care principles, but they think broader than care, and working with both researchers and governments and tribes to see how they can translate those into data infrastructure and data management practices. So they're helping us design that visualization that we workshopped in Alaska. And then I'll also say, like, some of our work is international. We actually have a partner in Buenos Aires in Argentina who does a lot of citizen science and studies citizen science, especially as it relates to water quality down there. We've collaborated with them on a data governance project and are kind of helping them think through what tools they might be able to use in that specific project. It's called Que Pasa Riachuelo. And then we also have this, you two might be particularly interested in this. We have a project called Open Climate it's been kind of on pause for a little bit, but we're kind of restarting. And this is a really international group of folks who are thinking about how to bridge the world of open science and open data with climate action. And a lot of times they're like people really kind of embedded in the open movement who are interested in climate action, but don't know how to make the connections or vice versa. And so I'm not sure where that work will go, but I do know that they're going to start having community meetings again, I think next month. So if either of you are interested, I can send you some information later once I know.
Yeah, that sounds cool.
Yeah.
What was that Spanish sounding one?
Yeah, Que Pasa Riachuelo. So KPR, and it's a project that's co-led by an organization called COACT. So if you look for I can actually maybe just type it in if we have a chat. I don't know if we have a chat.
Okay, yeah. I'm like, que pasa. I can't spell any of that.
Riachuelo is Riachuelo. And that's the name of I believe a watershed outside of Buenos Aires.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
So
Cool.
we do some
Okay,
international work,
things.
but we're a little more focused on the U.S. and it's just where we live and work and have expertise. But climate change is going to take everybody, climate action is going to take everybody. So we're very interested in seeing what's working in other places and what international collaborations can help support the movement.
Cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I found it there. That's great. Thanks a lot for your time. This is
Yeah,
really
of course.
interesting stuff. We got a lot to talk about and think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Katie.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious, like, you said you weren't sure what you were going to do with this conversation, but yeah, if you have any thoughts on, like, if there'll be something to share that I could, point people to eventually, or maybe we can just keep in touch and you can let me know what you decide to do with it.
We'll
For
try and
sure,
make
yeah.
some topic of some kind. Yeah, I'm just not sure. I'm self-conscious about putting out podcast episodes and videos. So like,
We haven't done it yet,
this
yeah.
will either be a video, or if it's not a video, it'll be audio. And if it's not audio, then I'll write a very lengthy article about it, and we'll send to you for sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do you want to see the draft before we put something out? Actually,
Sure. Yeah.
do that.
Let's
That's
do.
Yeah, might as well.
And yeah, I'll keep an eye out for your work. I'd love to just continue talking if things come up and it sounds like we might be aligned on some of our work. I'll definitely send you the open climate stuff once I know more, in case you're interested.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Okay, thanks a lot. Yeah, really nice to meet you.
All right.
Take care,
Talk to you
folks.
later. Have a good
Take
one.
care.
Bye.
Bye.